Coming up next, Forbes Adventurer columnist Jim Clash remembers his chats with the deceased maverick Sir Edmund Hillary, Dr. Edward Teller, and Steve Fossett. Stay tuned. Welcome to Adventurer, the show with guests who truly push their lives to the limits. No talking heads here, just the real deals. I'm Emily Schmall. Normally host Jim Clash is chatting up some famous explorer, but today the roles are switched. With the passing of Sir Edmund Hillary, Clash is in the guest chair to discuss his interview with the late Everest pioneer, as well as the late Dr. Edward Teller, father of the hydrogen bomb, and balloonist Steve Fossett, missing in the Nevada desert since last summer and presumed dead. Now, I know you did a tribute show about Sir Edmund Hillary. You met him, knew him. What was he like?
You know, his is a passing that really, it's a void that cannot be filled. I mean, this guy was the real deal in every sense of the word. He was a great man, a great athlete, the first to climb Everest, but he had a lot of humility, and he also had a good sense of humor. I remember meeting him 12 years ago in Chicago. I was awestruck meeting the great Sir Edmund Hillary, one of the reasons I got into adventure myself. And we did the interview, and I just remember at the end of the interview, this is a telling sort of anecdote, he's fumbling around in his pants for a business card, and I'm thinking, does he think I'm going to forget who he is, or I need some contact information? And I was thinking, what would the business card say? Ex-beekeeper from New Zealand, first to climb Mount Everest, Sears consultant. And he couldn't find a business card, and I was disappointed. So when I met him a few years later again, I asked him for the card, and of course he gave it to me, and all it said was Sir Edmund Hillary, and I think that kind of wraps it up.
An understated man.
A very understated man and a great man.
Now, Dr. Edward Teller, I'm sure he was a maverick of a different sort. He passed away when, in 2004?
2003, and I had one of the last big interviews with him. Of course, he was the father of the hydrogen bomb from Hungary. He was 93 when I interviewed him, and really the smartest guy I think I've ever met. When I first started asking him questions, he would kind of answer a question I didn't ask, and I thought, maybe this guy's out of it. Maybe he's lost his mind. But what he was doing was he was circling around the answer till he came to his point 10 minutes later. And by the time he came to the point, he had given you all this irrefutable evidence that you couldn't argue with him. He was a paranoid kind of guy. He had had all those problems with Oppenheimer from the Manhattan Project and the McCarthy trials. But he also was quite charming. I remember at one point I asked him, I said, if you had to make a list of the great minds of the 20th century, who would be on it? And he said, well, of course, Einstein, despite my misgivings of him later in life. You know, my fellow Hungarians, Leo Szilard, Johnny von Neumann, Eugene Wigner, of course, Niels Bohr. And I said, well, Dr. Teller, would you put your own name on that list? And he looked at me and he said, I have to leave some job for you to do. And I thought,
that's sweet.
Okay. But yes, a great man, really believed that if we hadn't gotten the H-bomb first, the Russians would have gotten it, and not necessarily they would have used it, but they would have used its influence to pressure the United States into things that we didn't want to do. So a really great man, one of the greatest scientists of the 20th century.
And what were his misgivings with Einstein?
Well, he thought that Einstein had done his best work when he was young, which is true of most physicists, and then later in life, he was pretty useless by the time that Teller had met him. But the young Einstein, he was a genius. That's what Teller said.
Now, Steve Fossett was a businessman, worked in Chicago in commodities before.
Yeah, he made a lot of money in the commodities market, and he became a professional adventurer. He retired after he'd made several $1 million and went out and did some pretty amazing things. When I had him on the show, I guess it was in 2006, he was talking about his latest venture, which was to try to break the land speed record set by Andy Green in the late 90s. This guy, Andy Green, drove a car at over 700 miles an hour and broke the sound barrier on the ground. Steve was going to buy Craig Breedlove's old car and try to do it himself. And when he was out there in Nevada, he was likely looking for a site to try that at. The thing that struck me about Fossett, again, he was humble, like all the great ones. Didn't look like an athlete, but had swum the English Channel, was the first to solo around the world in an airplane, solo around the world in a balloon. He had done a lot of amazing things that were both physical and, you know, adventurous in a more calculating way. And all I can say is I had lunch with him afterwards, and we talked about how he planned out his adventures. And he was the quintessential businessman. He looked at risk, in real terms. He looked at return, and he tried to figure out what was the best way and the least risky way to get that return. So I was pretty impressed by that.
Well, thanks, Jim.
Well, you know, it's sad that these three great men are no longer with us, but each one of them contributed in their own way and were adventurers and mavericks, so I thought it would be important to talk about them.
Again, Forbes Adventurer Jim Clash. I'm Emily Schmall. To read Jim's columns, pick up Forbes magazine or click on Forbes.com/adventurer. And thanks for watching the Forbes.com Video Network.